Welcome to the Institute of Health and Social Care Management and the latest in our equality, diversity and inclusivity special interest group meetings. Today we've got an absolute, well, it's a blockbuster really. It's a huge topic. It always attracts interesting views and opinions, and it's all about speaking up safely. I'm joined today by three, what can you say about these guys? Actually, these are all experts in their separate fields. They've all been there, seen it, done it. They've actually, many of them supported people who've been there, seen it and done it as well, and tried to speak up. So I'm not sure that any event anywhere on earth today would be blessed with so fine a group of people who can properly take us through the different questions and responses. We have the one and only Roger Kline is a research fellow at Middlesex University Business School, a long-term friend of the Institute, a long-term personal friend of mine as well. And Roger, we much respect and admire indeed the background that you have in this topic. We also have Tom Bell, Director and Lead Consultant at Cormetis Consulting. And Tom has actually also recently completed a short course masterclass for the Institute all about the means by which people can speak up effectively. And we have Rebecca Barker, Dr. Rebecca Barker, I'm so sorry, consultant anaesthetist and clinical lead for personalised care at Notts ICS. And Rebecca is also a Core 20+5 ambassador. Great to have you all along. Where would we start? I think could we just kick this off by asking why in January 2023, we are still obliged to run workshops, power hours, call it what you will, of this nature. Why is speaking up safely still such a difficult thing to do within health and social care? And perhaps we could start with Rebecca. Would you like to kick us off, Rebecca?
Yeah, of course. So I think there's a lot of ingrained cultures over a lot of years. So this isn't going to be a quick fix. This is a long-term plan. And the problem you've got is that I think we've got rid of a lot of the, or we've come a long way with the big problems, but it's the smaller, the little microaggressions, the little, death by 1,000 cuts rather than one big foul swoop. And they're harder to tackle. And I think that we have a spectrum from sort of subconscious bias, where we don't even realize, and we have to accept we all have those biases, every single one of us, all the way through to, active misogyny, racism, and other attacks on protected characteristics. And I think we are getting better, but we've still a way to go. And I think it is, the more events that we have like this, the more sort of airtime that we have, the better. And I think it starts with, it's a social problem. It's not just in health and social care, but by the younger generations are taught more about this, but there's still a lot of us who, a lot of these topics are quite difficult and sort of almost frightening. If you look at sort of transgender and transitioning, there's a lot of people who don't know how to talk about that or how to frame that. And so by having these conversations and by educating and by making it okay to talk about it, it's not a taboo subject. It all goes towards making a more diverse and inclusive environment that we work in.
Thank you, Rebecca. Great start. Roger, here we are, January 2023. I give up how many times you and I have had conversations of this ilk in the past. Why are we still doing it in January 2023?
So Rebecca's touched on some of the key things. So Robert Francis in 2013 described parts of the NHS as having a culture of avoidance and denial on difficult issues. He was talking specifically about patient care, but my view is that applies equally to a whole lot of other issues. So that's the first thing. We prefer to send good news upwards. We do what Mary Dixon Woods calls comfort seeking, not problem sensing when there are issues. The second thing is, and there's a wealth of research on this, people are anxious about raising concerns, either because they don't see that they're going to make any difference, it might make things worse, or because they are afraid of the consequences. And unfortunately, it's still the case that too many people who raise concerns are then seen as the problem rather than the issue that they raised. And the third, and in some ways now I think equally important issue, is we've adopted a model that relies on individuals raising concerns rather than organizations taking, if you like, a public health responsibility to deal with things that aren't going well or as they should do. So instead of, we have a wealth of data, instead of saying down in pediatrics or down in estates, there's something going on. Our data, our exit interviews, our staff survey data tells us something, and being proactively preventatively intervening there, we wait for individuals to do it. And the research is really clear. That is not a very effective method of dealing with changing culture. So I think people are interested. Megan Wrights has written a really lovely piece about that in the British Medical Journal. And perhaps the final thing I would say is it's then compounded by the fact that for some groups, particularly for BME staff and particularly for where there's a difference in seniority, there are other issues that make it more difficult, or people are more nervous about raising concerns. So that really relates to bigger issues in the NHS, which is very hierarchical and where people don't like to send bad news upwards. But actually, those who raise concerns should be seen as gold dust. And in the best organizations, they are.
Well, I don't think you're going to get many people disagreeing with what you've just said on this call, at any rate, Roger. So, Tom, has it got better? Has it got worse? Are we still kind of flatlining on this? Where are we at? Why? You know, I'm honestly, I kid you not, any of you, I must have attended probably 100 different events over the last 15 years where this has been the central topic of discussion. And when I knew that we were going to be talking about it today, I felt a kind of a knot in my stomach, because maybe it's our fault that we're just not pressing hard enough to remedy this. But Tom, where are we? What do you think? Why are we
first of all,
discussing it now?
Thank you, John, for that incredible introduction, that this would be the best presentation on the planet at this point in time. So that was well received. And it is a great question. And the reason I say it's a great question is I'm going to tell you a very short story in a moment. But I was presenting at the Patient Safety Congress last year in Manchester. And the topic I was presenting on is, why isn't the NHS learning? Yeah. So for NHS expand health and care sector. Yeah. And Professor Mary Dixon-Woods, that Roger referred to there, was on the panel. And she quite openly said, and I thought it was very refreshing, actually, her honesty. She said, we could cut and paste most of the content from the reports into things that have gone wrong and whistleblowing issues from the last 15, 20 years. And we just keep repeating that cycle, and it just keeps going round and round. In answer to your question, I think it's got worse. That's the straight answer. I genuinely believe it has got worse, and there's a reason for that, by the way. It's a reason that we can't control in this seminar. But I think the economy, I think we're now in a position where people in their everyday lives are having to run faster on the hamster wheel just to stand still. Now, if you perceive that there's a risk in speaking up, which existed maybe 15 years ago, where you could perhaps walk into another job if you lost yours, that is gone. So people now have more to lose by speaking up. That's the practical bit here. Yeah, we are. And when you asked why things haven't changed, I think it's because we haven't changed. As people, we're still the same species that we were 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago. We still have the same behavioral traits. The short story I was going to tell you to try and bring what I mean to life is, you might have seen this trick done where somebody will come into an audience and with a closed hand, and they'll ask, who's afraid of spiders? Right? And so a couple of people will put their hands up. And so a person will come towards them and say, I've got a spider in my hand, yeah. And they'll, if they're really afraid, perhaps arachnophobic, they'll run. Yeah. Now, if there is a spider in the hand, or if there isn't a spider in the hand, is almost immaterial. The next time that person says, I haven't got something in my hand now, do you believe them? Does the fear still come? Do you still run out the room when they get close to you on the off chance that they might be being disingenuous? And the point I'm making is that we have become so conditioned to these things that it's incredibly difficult. And I think Rebecca was absolutely bang on the money there, where she said, we have these inbuilt biases. I myself grew up in what I would call a very bigoted household, and my wife still challenges me, quite rightly, on some of the views that I inadvertently express when I'm, unguarded, if that's the right phrase. Yeah. So that capacity is there. And what's really difficult, I think, sometimes is, especially for people like me, white, 50s, grey hair, how do I relate to some of these issues and understand them? And the honest answer is that sometimes I can't. I'm probably not the right person to understand them. My point is that culture, we talk about culture change as if it's a thing that can happen. And then we disempower people by saying that it's the organization that needs to change and not them. Yeah. And somehow the organizational journey is exactly the same as the personal journey. In fact, it won't happen without the personal journey. The organization is no more than the sum of the actions of its constituent parts, which are the individuals within it. And the people that succeed in the organizations that dominate our health and care sector at the moment are the people that have learned to survive and thrive in the environments that rewarded them for doing what they've always done. Nobody ever rose up the hierarchy by challenging. That doesn't happen. If you've ever sat in NHS management meetings, as I'm sure everybody here has, people don't challenge. The people that rise.
All right. So sorry to cut, because we've got lots of questions to go through. Why is that still the case, though, Tom? It's at least 15 years in my personal experience. For many of you, Roger in particular, you've been dealing with this kind of thing for decades.
Isn't the question really, John?
Why is it still happening, Tom?
Why wouldn't it still happen is my question. Why wouldn't it still happen? When people are rewarded.
Okay, so I'm going to come to Rebecca now and say, look, we have a superstructure within health and social care that is almost orientated to persuading people not to speak up because the consequences are so profound for them. So we have things like CQC galumphing around, kind of putting the fear of God into people and organizations. We therefore have boards and chief executives telling their people that they're better flipping well smarten up their act, ready for the CQC inspection and so on. This is an environment where the consequences of admitting fallibility and vulnerability and error are profound. Is therefore the superstructure one of the problems?
So going backwards a little bit, I think that part of the we're talking about NHS leadership and management and going up the ranks and wanting to pass up the right, not give bad news. I think one of the things is we've learned, or people who succeed have learned about EDI, about how there's values-based interviews, all these things. They've learned the right words. So people know not to say, to be very guarded in how they are and to say the right words. When they get into those positions, they don't then necessarily have to do those actions that they say they're going to do. So by having these events where we talk about it, whereby we say how terrible it is, and there is so much culture in it, within, if you look at job adverts, it talks about EDI and all these things. So people know that that's what we're looking at. There are EDI leads in trusts across the country, but then it doesn't necessarily then translate into actual actions on the ground and actual management of issues when they happen, because it's time consuming, it's difficult, and there needs to be a proper support and proper actual genuine desire from a whole trust structure to want to change. If I was going to change things, I would want organizations to look at the staff within them and to actually get the data about how many women you've got, how many of all the different rate of different BME colleagues you've got, and then see if their management structure reflects their workforce. And if not, you need to ask the questions. You need to do a deep dive into why are people not applying for those jobs, or why are they not getting them? What is the root cause? Is it that? And I've had this myself. Someone said, you'd be really great in that role, but would you be better waiting until your children were at secondary school? Now, the people who are in that role, who are male, have got children who are younger than mine. So by having those, and that it could be subconscious and nice, but you need to go out and you need to ask those people and ask the sort of the BMA staff, why aren't you applying for these roles? What is it? Because we talk about meritocracy, but when you get to an interview and you sort of say the best person got the job, has everybody on that carousel had the same opportunities, regardless within an EDI perspective? Have they all been offered the same opportunities? Or do we subconsciously give the opportunities to certain groups, certain cohorts who are seen as the people who always do things? Do we make sure that the opportunities go to people of all different ethnicities, of different genders, so that everyone, when you get to the interview, it's too late to put your EDI principles in, because you've had this, the journey there is not the same. There are different hurdles and different things, and that's why you've got a problem when it gets to the end.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to open it up to questions fairly shortly, but just not right now. Geraldine, I promise I will come to you. You'll be first up when we do the questions. Roger, you wrote Snowy White Peaks heaven knows how long ago. You've revisited that and you've published on that vein of form. We know the answer to Rebecca's question. We know that not everybody gets the same opportunity. Is it the superstructure's fault or the infrastructure's fault? In other words, is this fixable, or do we have to demolish it first and rebuild something new?
Well, I think it is fixable. I think there are some organisations that are doing significantly better than others, and I see some of them. There are some that are terrible. But if I was a medical director or a finance director or a nurse director, and I went to the board and says, we want to do X, we want to do something about the funding, or we want to tackle an issue with MRSA or whatever, we would expect to be challenged on why we think what we are proposing has a reasonable likelihood of success. What's the research? Who else is doing it? And so on. We don't do that with EDI. We just do it on, it's sort of built on a kind of pack of cards of good intentions. We don't adopt evidence interventions. So when I wrote No More Tick Boxes in 2021, that was basically a demolition of precisely the sorts of things that Rebecca's talked about. We assume that if you have the right policies and the right procedures and the right training, including unconscious bias training, miraculously, that's going to change the culture and the outcomes. There's no research evidence for that approach whatsoever. And instead, you have to have a different paradigm, really, a paradigm that starts with accountability, that addresses the issue of bias by debiasing processes rather than just relying on debiasing people, and which then says without the leaders in an organization, and not just the board, but other leaders themselves living their values, personally placing themselves at the front of that work, even the best plans won't work. So you have to have evidence-based interventions, have to be led by those with responsibility for leading. And when that happens, it does change outcomes. But until very recently on recruitment and career progression, we haven't done it. But if you look at discipline, it's really interesting. So I suggested 5 years ago, that what we should do is stop trying to have diverse panels for disciplinary issues. They weren't making much difference. Stop people entering the disciplinary process who shouldn't. Look at some of the research, insert what I called a bias interrupter, a behavioral nudge at the beginning that says, before John Wilkes can discipline me, you have to demonstrate what will be learnt from doing it and who benefits from doing it. And then are you treating people the same, whether they're men and women, black and white? And in the last 4 years in the NHS, the number of disciplinary cases have reduced by 36%. And the relative likelihood of black and white staff entering the disciplinary process has been more than halved. So if you do evidenced interventions, they are much more likely to succeed than good intentions. So that's a key thing. It's not the only thing, but if you don't do that, you've got no chance of changing things.
I like that, Roger. Thank you very much. Tom, I'm going to come to you and frame this slightly differently. So we've got a blood contamination scandal that is far from resolved at present. There's an inquiry that's due to present, I think, later this year. We're going to have an event, by the way, on how to manage bad news, difficult news, how to admit weakness later on this year in response to it. But there's people there who were in positions of authority and who knew what was taking place in respect of the contaminated blood. And it looks as though they willfully chose not to divulge what was going on or admit that there was a problem. In other words, what happened as a result of that, the problem just escalated. It brought in even more people who unfortunately, ended up profoundly ill and have passed away, many of them, as a result of that contaminated blood. But this is that you can't just identify, well, there's one person who was culpable there, or maybe even a small group who was culpable. This is a system-wide business where if anybody had, and they did have, reservations or suspicions about what was taking place, they were just quietened down, or said, oh, don't be silly, or they were just made to look foolish, or they were actively discouraged. And as a result of that, it's a system failure that ultimately was responsible. And I'm just using this as an example in my usual ham-fisted way. I'm taking a long time to say a straightforward question, which is, even if we bring in things like allyship, if we use safe space areas, speak up guardians and so on, if the system is rotten, then what on earth difference would those small things make to it? So that's the question I've got for you, Tom.
Okay. Well, first of all, just to support what I said earlier in terms of, I think when you asked whether things have got worse or better, there is evidence to suggest they have got worse. And the reason I say that is you now don't see any large health and care organisation without a senior person in a comms and PR role. And one of my arguments has been for a long time that we need to strip public sector organisations of PR departments and PR activity and instead replace it with information departments and information-based activity. We should almost have a department of understanding rather than a PR department. When we talk about systems, it's interesting that Bill Kirkup, when he was looking into the events at university hospitals in Morecambe Bay, he made the observation that you couldn't excuse everything by talking about the system, because I think that has been done on many occasions. We don't hold people accountable for their behaviours and the decisions that they make because we say it was a system failing. I guess I would say this, wouldn't I? But I'm slightly different, because as a whistleblower, I made what I call the right decision, which cost me my career in the NHS. So I wouldn't say that lightly. And I think what we need to do is we need to understand why people behave the way they behave, but not excuse it, if that makes sense. So
that makes
those
sense,
people
Tom.
that you're talking about who are, let's forgive, let's understand, but we can still forgive, but we can still hold people accountable. And if it emerges that there were people who knew, who made those decisions that might have cost lives, and that made decisions to silence people whose speaking up could have saved lives, then those people need to be held accountable. What that accountability is, I'm not sure. But I do find it interesting that there are behaviours we excuse in the public sector that we would never excuse in public. In other words, if you led to someone's death outside of a hospital as a citizen, then you'll end up in court. And that will be the right thing. But if you've contributed to deaths within the system as we define it, then somehow it's excused by the system and you're never held accountable. And I find it fascinating. This morning there was a chief executive of an NHS trust, you might have heard this on the news, talking about how terrible it was that chief executives could be held accountable and possibly end up in prison for things that were beyond their control in terms of the turmoil that's occurring within the NHS at the moment. And he was talking about the issue of corporate manslaughter. And there's something interesting there, isn't there, that person stood up to the plate when there was a threat to them. Yeah. But that very same person will have known for years, if not decades, that the path that the NHS and the healthcare system has been on would lead us to this point. So they've kept quiet while it served their needs and while they didn't have to rock the boat. But now there's a personal threat to them. They're finding their voice. Something I find a little bit, it sticks in my crop, shall we say. You're right. If the system is rotten, and in many respects, I think rotten is an interesting word. It's rather like a large piece of oak, isn't it? Where you've got these fabulous bits that are doing great stuff, but you've got other bits, rather like this beam here that I've had to reinforce because it's got some woodworm in it somewhere. There are bits of the system that are rotten. I don't quite know how you address that. Do you reach a point, John, where you say, well, I'm walking away from this because it is rotten? And I think in many respects, you see the recruitment and retention crisis is partly linked to that whole way of responding to the way people are managed, do you put your head above the parapet and possibly risk losing your job? Or do you just say, hang on, for the greater good of my family and I and the people that I love, I will continue to go to work and get paid for what I do? That many people would say that's the pragmatic decision. Put your head down and keep going.
All right, Rebecca, I'm going to try to kind of bring this up and give us some positivity now about, okay, so what can we do about this? You know, if you look at the Metropolitan Police and the utter turmoil that they're in at present as a result of the abhorrent actions of the animal they've just found, you know, living within their ranks, working within their ranks, basically, you know, finding the sources of rot, to go back to that analogy, is often fairly problematic and difficult because you know, they're surrounding themselves with other people of a similar mindset, perhaps. But we've talked about things like setting up safe spaces. We've talked about charters and so on, and the introduction of charters and obliging people to sign up to these things. We've established things like Speak Up Guardians and so on. Is there more that we can do, do you think, now? And could you give some examples of stuff that we could perhaps now do that would help us to move this forward and improve matters?
There was a really good article in The Lancet a couple of years ago about myths and solutions for gender inequality in medicine. And one of the solutions actually transcends all kinds of EDI principles and whatever protected characteristics you look at. And I really liked it because it talked about treating it like a quality improvement project and using the same structures to try and find solutions, to have behavioral frameworks of this is the expectations, but also with what happens if that isn't happened. So from experience, I think we have a lot of these frameworks, civility saves lives, all these things, but there's not the so what, that if something happens, what do you do? From a personal perspective, the trust where I work, there's a very strong, lot of work done around racism, particularly racism towards doctors from patients and from other members of the communities, as well as within the workforce. And in some ways that's easy. If it's overt, there's a very clear sort of leadership around the yellow card system, red card system, and what to do in that situation. Part of that is then socializing it so that the doctors on the front line, the FY ones, when it happens, know what to do. And it's also empowering medical leaders to be able to confront that, because it's difficult and no one likes having a difficult conversation. I think the freedom to speak up and things are really good and positive things. The worry I always have is that, and things that I've heard in the past, is about sexism isn't a woman's problem to solve. Racism isn't an ethnic minority problem to solve. It's up to all of us to solve. And I think quite often what it is you end up with a group of really quite enthusiastic people who want to sort of, create awareness and to make strategies and to make things better. But often you find that actually is the groups that it affects who are leading that work, and which is great, but it needs proper structure, proper support, proper framework behind that. So it's not just leaving the protected characteristic to sort out their own problems. It's everyone's problems, and that's the importance with allyship.
I think that's a really important point that you've made very well, Rebecca. Thank you. Roger, I was in the I've recently visited the Churchill War Rooms in London, underneath the sort of part of the Foreign Office, where Churchill and his war cabinet kind of, buried underground, kind of plotted what the heck was going on. There's a fascinating piece there. There's a map. Okay, it's a map of the North Atlantic. It's got the United States and it's got Britain and Europe on it. And there are thousands of tiny little pinpricks on there. And what they were doing, of course, back in the days, kind of pre-computer generated images, they were plotting the progress or otherwise of ships in convoys coming over from the United States and Canada. And if anybody looks at that, you can't but be moved by the volume of these tiny little pinpricks, but also the fact that so many of those ultimately pins are kind of thrown on the floor. They're lost, you know, they were sunk by U-boats or accidents or whatever else it might be. And
is that all right?
I've just lost Roger for a second. He'll be back in a moment. The reason I'm bringing that analogy in place is, if we looked at all of the incidents that have taken place within health and social care over the years and kind of tried to map all of the outcomes of those things, we'd end up with exactly the same kind of look. We'd end up with a project planner, lots of little pinpricks on there, but a load of those pins would have ended up on the floor in the bin because it didn't resolve and that person left, or that person was moved on, or something of that nature. I just think there's an analogy there. Help us to understand, when you've got involved in cases, how have you helped them to get satisfactory resolved for the people who've been adversely affected by them? Does that make, am I making sense? What are some of the things that you would suggest to organizations when they've been faced with a crisis, or even if it's a small team of people who are faced with a crisis, they know they've got a problem, how do they best resolve it? What's some of the steps they can sensibly take?
So I sometimes start with, there are lots, not enough, but there are lots of examples of leaders who do the right thing in the health service. I can think of quite a lot. There's lots that don't, but there's lots that do. So I often start for organizations by giving examples of how a particular organization addressed an issue, and not to say you could just lift and dump that in a new organization. And then there's a secondary issue of what advice you give to individuals, but for organizations. So let me give you an example. I won't name the trust.
Oh, go on.
Chief executive and his medical director every Thursday would spend the morning in a different department, just sitting down. It wasn't like a visit to see people, just having coffee with people. And they knew that in a particular department, their staff survey data, your little dots, told them there were issues. Exit interviews told them there were dots. The gossip told them that there were dots. So they went to this, it's a large department, spent 2.5 hours there. Nobody spoke about bullying, which was the issue. Nobody. But they did notice that 1 or 2 people were looking around, but nobody spoke. They headed off down the corridor, about to, long corridor, hospital corridor, about to turn a corner, and the medical director says to the chief executive, I think some of the people we've been talking to are following us. So like a pair of sort of amateur muggers, they waited around the corner. When the staff got there, they said, are you looking for us? And they said, yeah. So the chief exec said, come into this room. What's the issue? They said, blah, 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 blah. It's terrible, etc., etc. It's dangerous for patients. It's bad for us. Lots of turnover. So the chief executive said this, I'm going to get some paper. You're all going to write down and sign what you have just told me. And I've given you my personal guarantee in front of the medical director. There will be no consequences. We will deal with it. So the next morning, he went up to the same department, saw the head of department, a big department, and said, a number of people have raised concerns. We have other data. There's a bullying culture here. Can we go and have a chat? And without any prompting, the head of department said, I know who's told you. I know what it's about. So the chief exec said, right, stop there. You need to come to my office now. I'm suspending you. I wasn't going to suspend you because I know there are pressures in this department, but I've given my word. We're not going to shoot the messenger.
Yeah.
And therefore, you're suspended. In fact, that person left, and it transformed the culture within the organization. It goes back to my earlier point. Organizations need to be proactive and preventative, a public health approach. They've got mountains of data. People know formally and informally where the problems are in an organization. They also know where the good practice is. We don't make enough use of it. And there are examples. I mean, Merseycare is an example that have taken that to a sort of more organizational sense by trying to build a just culture. They've had challenges, but they've been really open about the challenges. So I think we have to build on what research tells us is more likely to work, and then find places that have tried to do it. Often they've hiccuped and there's been bumps in the road. That's what I say to organizations primarily. Do not rely on policies, procedures, and training.
Yeah.
Don't formalize, don't insist that people formalize all issues. You deal with them. Don't wait for individuals to be brave enough or stupid enough to raise concerns. And it works.
I think that's a great answer to my rather elaborate and overlong question in the first place. Thank you very much, Roger. Tom, would you like to elaborate on what Roger has said? I mean, it strikes me we've got these pockets of excellence, and where those pockets of excellence exist, Roger's quite right. They've got the data. They know where the outliers are, good and bad, by the way. They've got inklings, but they're bold enough to go and do something about it. You know, they don't shrink back from confrontation, or as Rebecca said a little while ago, you know, nobody likes difficult conversations, but these people do not shrink from having those difficult conversations.
I think it's wonderful, actually, what Roger's just said, and fabulous to hear that somebody's actually done that. You know, the chief executive has. You know, I think you.
I have to say, sorry to interrupt. I suspect it's being done quite widely, but we don't tend to hear about that good stuff. We instead, and understandably, by the way, we tend to hear about the problems that people have had and so on. But I think Roger's probably right. I think there's widespread good stuff. But sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. I think the jury's out on that. Is my honest response. I think, you know, yes, there will always be people who will do the right thing. Let's call it the right thing. But Rebecca said earlier, and I think she was quite right, that people who survive and succeed in the system often learn the language of success. They learn the language of the day and the narrative of the day. It's the equivalent of, you know, they know the tune, but they can't remember the words. Yeah, and it's not ingrained. It's not actually the way they are. Those same people would shift if the culture changed back. I think what's interesting about Roger's example is you've got somebody there who clearly has a moral compass, it would appear. And that's, you know, we underestimate the importance of that. That's a behavioural, let's call it a characteristic if you like, but that moral compass has served them incredibly well and served their staff and their patients incredibly well as well, which it sounds tremendous. We talked about data, and I'm a huge fan of data in as much as I'm an advocate of the phrase that data saves lives, and I'm also a believer in the phrase that lack of data costs lives. I don't think you can have one phrase without the other, yeah? Although one is less polite to say in certain circles. The absence of data within the NHS is costing lives. We don't have enough data. Yes, don't get me wrong, totally on board with Roger, there's reams of it there, but it's not collated and made visible. And there's an old phrase that says that the best disinfectant is sunlight. And I think that that transparency, if you like, that data, whether that's available internally or to the public, again, this comes back to my point that we need to scrap that whole PR attitude to running a public sector organisation. You know, it's not about how we manage our reputation that matters. It's about how we improve. You know, where is that department of understanding that says, actually, okay, we need to do this if we're going to serve the patients and the staff better. And you can't do one without the other, as I'm sure everyone here knows. So let's make that data visible to the right people at every level. There's no reason why any of that data should be withheld. But the first challenge then is finding that data where it exists and pulling it to the fore, isn't it? Because let me bring this to life with an example for you. When I joined the NHS in 2012, and I appreciate that's a few years ago now, I asked my director of, I think he was called Director of Strategy and Business Development, and I made two fatal mistakes. One was asking him for a copy of the strategy because he didn't have a strategy, but that's okay. And then I said, where's the dashboard? How do I access the dashboard that will show me the type and frequency of demand? And he looked at me like I was speaking Swahili. And I'd come from a private sector background, worked for Carlsberg, where 10 years previously we could understand demand. We understood what was going on in that business, return on capital employed, right down to the last bottle of pop that we'd sold. So to step into the NHS and find out from this guy that they were still actually doing most of what they did on paper, and therefore didn't have the chance to collate it and make it visible and understand the type and frequency of demand, all the issues, etc. That blew my brain. Interestingly, I don't think that situation has changed a great deal. I do think the data would be incredibly helpful. It would require a focused effort on that. And I think what we should have is consistent data sets across the NHS, rather than each trust being able to choose what it does and what it doesn't do and having its own memorandum and articles and its own strategy and its own plans and da 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 da, and all you know, different sets of values. I mean, come on, what's all that about? You know, an NHS trust with a different set of values to the one next door to it. Crackers, bonkers. So yeah, let's use data. Let's use it effectively, and let's make it visible. Shall I shut up before I fall off my soapbox?
Okay, I have to give this a little prelim so that you three can have a bit of a think here. Because what I want you to think about, I want you each to give 2 things that you would do tomorrow if you were in a position to influence it, which you think would make a measurable and effective difference to the extent to which people are able to safely speak up. Okay, and that could be organizational, it could be system, it could be individual, it could be charters, it could be enshrining of law. What would you, 2 things each, that's all you get. I'm going to put my genie hat on and give you those 2 wishes, not 3 wishes, 2 wishes, whereby you're able to decide what those things would be. I'll take this off for now, and I'm trying to give you, as you can see, I'm kind of flailing around trying to give you time to think of these 2 things. You don't have to do them right now, because what I'm going to do while you're jotting these 2 things down each, and we'll come to you at the end, going to give it 10 minutes for some questions from our audience.
This is such a growing space. I think there's this whole incoming of the ICS and the ICBs, and actually I know a lot have been spoken about the NHS, obviously thinking about social care as well. And from the point of inclusion, how can the isn't it so the question would be to everyone would be, now with the incoming of the ICS and the ICBs, wouldn't it be a great time to really set new standards, especially with an NHS and social care? Because as much as they are working in the same space, they work slightly differently, but they're still trying to get the same aim for the end user. So really and truly, from an inclusion point of view, really sharing data from the NHS, but as well as social care, because we know social care, the workforce in social care is actually greater than that of the NHS that people aren't aware of. They're actually really bringing it together and really making it inclusive. I love what Rebecca said about actually focusing on really giving some real guidance, because when it comes to areas such as discrimination, there isn't a lot of people really fearful actually to raise their head. So actually great guidance on there is really important. So I think it's good. So I guess in the long and short of it, how can the ICS and the ICB really use this momentum and time to actually help with an EDI sort of agendas for the sector?
Okay, thank you, Dudley. Would anybody like to, would Roger or Rebecca or Tom like to answer that? Roger, you.
Unless Rebecca wants to go first. Sorry.
No, it's fine. Yeah.
Rebecca's still writing down her.
I speak at a number of ICS boards and other ICS meetings, and without naming the organisation, because they haven't taken the decision yet, myself and a colleague gave a presentation. It's the only presentation I've ever given where there were no questions. There were no questions because there was a brilliant board discussion kicked off by somebody from the local authority, county council. It was about race, saying the murder of George Floyd was a wake-up moment. This is what she tried to do in the council. As an ICS, we have a lot of responsibilities and potentially some power. Let's focus on that. And it went round for an hour without myself or the other person being asked a question or needing to say anything. And gradually, there was a consensus they had to do something reasonably decisive. And to my astonishment, they agreed that when we came back to another meeting, which has been booked, they would want to discuss what might they do using their powers as commissioners to say to organizations, unless you can demonstrate in some way that you're serious about tackling racism, because that's a core part, respect for people, patients, and the staff is a core part of good services, we will have to reconsider whether we're going to commission you to provide services. And when we came off the call, myself and the colleague, we sort of looked at each other. I won't say what we said, but it was along the lines of bloody hell. Now, I'm not saying that's what you have to do, but I think boards are new. They have power. There does seem to be in quite a lot of them some consensus that this is an issue they should do something about. And I'm hoping that a mixture of those sorts of initiatives in terms of services and taking on board some of the stuff that's finally coming through in terms of evidence-based interventions on discipline, on recruitment and career progression, and the beginnings of better approaches to speaking up and bullying, you only need a few ICSs to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Health service is like a flock of sheep. You know, if a few good managers do the right thing, it is the case on some occasions that everybody else will follow. So I'm a little bit of, I'm not a complete optimist, but I do sometimes look at the sort of half full approach, and I think there's an opportunity here, not helped, my final point will be, by the method of appointing people to ICSs that was a complete car crash.
Let's not go there. That's the topic of another conversation, yeah. Roger.
But actually, this is the third ICS that I've spoken at where people have really been determined to do stuff.
Yeah.
So I think there will be a minority, but quite a few that will say, actually, we're going to take this seriously because it's good for patient care.
Perfectly put. I think we'll all agree there. Thank you, Roger. If you don't mind, Rebecca, rather than asking you to answer that question as well, do you mind if we go to Robbie's question that we've got in the chat?
John, I'm just going to try again.
Have I managed to hear you? We can hear you.
The wonder of technology. If you just keep pressing every setting, it eventually says it now works.
I'll remember that. Tech 21, Jade. Tech 21. Go on, Robbie.
Yeah, hi everyone. Robbie Naylor, head of EDI at an integrated care board. So I can completely relate to what you were just saying, Roger. And it's not Nottingham, but that is a place or somewhere towards that. Just on a slightly separate note is where I think we need to get to, in that we move away from this tick box exercise of you can provide the service, but actually what is the bigger impact of that around intersectionality, around health inequalities, around the much broader picture. And actually commissioning needs to move away from just that. Yes, you can physically provide 6 ambulances, great, tick, but actually if they've all got 3 wheels and no trained staff on board and it's that age-old thing, isn't it? But in terms of my question, I suppose in the current climate, and we all know what the issues are, you know, staffing, A&E issues, strikes, etc. How do we engage senior colleagues? And I suppose I'm thinking, you know, sort of deputy director and above level, who are so focused on the day-to-day operational pressures that are right across the system, whether that's integrated care boards, whether that's acute trust, mental health trusts, ambulance services, social care, it doesn't really matter. Yeah. But how do we get them to not forget about things like EDI, things like speaking up, and not fall down the rabbit hole of, we know it's tough for everybody, kind of have to get on with it. If it's tough and everybody starts to fall apart a little bit at the seams.
We've got the question. Thank you, Roger. Sorry to push you along. I'm just conscious of the time here. Rebecca, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, so I think some of this is like the thing of like, if you look after the pennies, the pounds look after themselves. If you have a positive culture, and if you have where the principles of EDI are there, then the staffing issues are helped by it. It is an enabler to providing good quality care, even when things are really hard. So if you look at things like the strikes, that is because people are tired, they've had erosion of their pay, their working conditions and things like that. It's all very here and now. What I think happens sometimes with our cultures is that normalization of poor behaviors. So everyone will have this, you start off on one set and then something happens and it sort of drifts a little bit, and then that becomes a new normal that's not quite as good, and then it drifts a bit further, and then that becomes the new normal. And then before you know it, you put your head up and you realize you're so far away from what is safe and what is good. So I think these principles of EDI, these principles of a positive culture, of looking after each other, of respect, and all those things that come along under that umbrella actually enable the culture to stay in the right place, to enable us to have that ability to whistleblow, to say, look, because it goes back to that feeding up good news. I want someone to go, there is a problem, I can't provide the care, how do I do it? And then we can work it out together. I don't want someone going, we only want to tell them that it's good. You know, it doesn't work like that. And my worry is always that normalization of poor behaviors and that slow drift, creep and grow towards that. So I think if you look after the simple things and you look after the important cultural bits, then actually the whole the care that you give and your ability to be engaged with your workload is far easier than if you are managing all that workload but also feeling bullied and harassed by people you work with. Not easy, and it requires a lot of difficult leadership to have the compassion and the empathy to lead in that way, and that moral compass to lead in that way. But for me, that's the way it should be.
Thank you, Rebecca. And of course, you've only to look at the evidence as well, Robbie. There is widespread evidence, Professor Beverly Alamo Metcalf, Gallup, Corporate Leadership Council, and more. They've got bags of evidence that says if you demonstrate concern for people, if you help people and to feel supported and empowered and confident, guess what? They're more effective in terms of the work that they do. So I think there's evidence as well there that says, do you know what? That's probably how you engage senior leaders to speak up on EDI related issues. You just show them the evidence to say, you can make your people more high performing if you take this seriously. All right, look, we're so close to the end of this, and I've got a meeting that I've got to be at 1 o'clock as well. So I'm going to don it. Here we go. There we are. I've got my genie hat on. Tom, I'm going to give you your 2 wishes first. Here you go. Rub the lamp. There you go. What are they?
Right. So first wish is that everyone who takes a management position at whatever level within the health and care sector has to understand the concept of servant leadership. And that would be everyone who's going through the Leadership Academy, anyone who's going through any sort of care related management and supervision training. And not just understand it, but be told that they will be tested on it, held accountable for it, and asked for examples of when they've done it, and they should keep a log of that.
So we've got a code of practice, by the way, at the Institute, that we say, if you join the Institute, you're automatically signing up to that code of practice as well. So that might be part of it. Sorry, Tom.
I think the trick is, how do you monitor that? And that's the key, isn't it? They have to be able to show you tangible examples of where they demonstrated servant leadership.
Like
That'd be my first one. The second one is anonymous 360 multi-level appraisal. That's, I think, and those comments should be made visible across the organisation.
Like that. Okay, I like that. Would those be anonymous, or
you can put your name to them if you're feeling brave, or you can make them anonymous if you're not feeling brave?
Got you.
But you should be allowed the opportunity to share your views on your leaders.
Thank you, Tom. Let's go to Roger next.
I think
sorry, I've got to do the thing with Tom. Shazam, and they will happen. There we are. Roger, to you now.
Okay, Tommy. So I think probably 2 things. The first is to try to be proactive and preventative, rather than just relying on individuals to flag concerns. So you're kind of ambulance chasing. So, for example, we know that psychological safety provides for better and safer care and is better for staff. Be proactive and preventative and look out for places that are undermining that, but also bits of the organisation that may be much better. Yeah. And the second is always be on the lookout for symbolic actions.
Like that, yeah.
Right. So some of you may know the example of Andrew Foster. I'll name a chief exec this time. A white patient walks into A&E, says, "I want to see a white doctor." And the junior says, "No, we don't do that here." Gets the consultant says, "Sorry, we give you the doctor that's available unless there's some very, very good reason. There's no good reason for having a white doctor rather than a black doctor." Guy gets some kind of treatment anyway, goes off to his local paper, front page, next week in the Wigan Courier or whatever it is. Patient rights undermined by trust, his right to choose his doctor. Andrew Foster went down to see the editor and said, "I want the right of reply next week on your front page." He got it, and he said, "If this person comes into our A&E next time, we will of course patch him up so he can go somewhere else to find a trust for the longer treatment that gives him the right to choose his own doctor, because we don't do it here." And the impact within the trust, both on the BME doctors and the other doctors, the BME doctors, crikey, this guy's giving us air cover.
Yeah.
And everybody else knew where they stood. And that was one single symbolic action that was worth 100 policies.
All right, I'm going to have to hurry us along. Thank you, Roger. And Shazam, I grant them. There we are, the genie. There we are. Dr. Rebecca, you get the last go here. Come on, what are your two?
I'll be really quick. So first of all, that all organisations have the data sort of publicly available of their senior leadership diversity makeup compared to their organisational diversity makeup.
Like that. Good.
And secondly, that in order to socialise EDI principles, that all meetings, I mean, I come from a medical sphere, so we have lots of medical conferences, but any sort of conferences that you have a reminder session on EDI principles of just little bits and pieces, like, you know, intersectionality of exam results for international medical graduate doctors versus non, just bits like that, just to continually drip feed that socialization of those issues that are had on a day-to-day practice, because that's how you change culture. It's that sort of slow grind of realization of it being in the subconscious in the background. That I've heard that before.
I love that. Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm sorry, Shazam, granted. And that's very practical. I mean, that's doable, I think.
Yeah.
Apologies to Farmin and Ivy, you've sent me direct questions. We've simply run out of time. I've got a dash. I've got to say huge thanks once again to Roger, to Tom, to Rebecca. Haven't they been absolutely magnificent? I think that's an absolute masterclass how to do this. And we've learned a whole heap of stuff. We've got some great ideas for you all to go off and maybe start to put some pressure on your organizations, or even change your own behaviors and those around you. So thank you all. We will see you on the next one. That's been really uplifting. Thank you very much indeed all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.